Hilchos Teshuva Perek Aleph Halacha Beis. Sar Mishtaleach. The Sar Mishtaleach, the goat that was sent down the mountainside, which was designated through the Gorol. The Kohen Gadol had drawn lots, and the lot where it came out in his right hand and his left hand was Sar Lazazel, was meant to be thrown down the mountainside. Fishu Kapora al Kol Yisrael. Since this animal is a kapora for all Klal Yisrael, Kohen Gadol misvad olov al loshen Kol Yisrael. So the Kohen Gadol says the vidui, and the terminology is he's confessing on behalf of all Klal Yisrael. Shenemar v'svad olov es kol avonos bnei Yisrael. This is the pasuk. He confesses upon this goat all the sins of Bnei Yisrael. Although we had mentioned yesterday, vidui is a mitzvah shebegufo. It's something you normally can't delegate. But since the korban itself is a korban, it's not a korban, as we will discuss. We just began yesterday the Rambam. The animal itself brings this kapora, represents Klal Yisrael. Therefore, and the Kohen is the one who's designated by the Torah to say the vidui. Therefore, it's not considered it's delegated to him, but rather he is the representative of Klal Yisrael. Now, the Sar Mishtalech, what does it atone for? Sar Mishtalech mechaper alav kol averos shebetorah, hakalos v'chamuros. Every sin, whether it's less severe, more severe, it atones. Ben she'ova b'zoda, ben she'ova b'shkoga. Normally, the korban only atones for something which is b'shogeg. The Sar Mishtaleach, whether it's kalos chamuros, it atones. Whether it's mezer or shogeg, deliberate or inadvertent. Ben shahodalo, whether he's aware that he had violated it. Ben shlohodalo, he's not even aware. Shogeg, you violate inadvertently, but ultimately you become aware that you had transgressed. Here it atones, even if the person hasn't even come to the realization he had violated it already, and later he realizes after Sar Mishtalech is brought, the Sar Mishtalech is mechaper, hakol miskaper b'Sar Mishtalech. V'ush osa tshuva. That's only the tshuva. But again, normally, if a person, let's say, had violated something that carries the death penalty, or kores, tshuva itself is not sufficient for kapara. But regarding the Sar Mishtaleach, although it's chamuros, Mrs. Bezdin is chamur, kores is chamur, if he did tshuva before the Sar Mishtaleach was taken out and thrown down the mountainside, he has kapara. Avon Melosa tshuva. But if he hadn't done tshuva and the Sar Mishtaleach was taken out and thrown down the mountainside, Einach Sor Bechaper El Alakalos. The Sor is Mechaper, but it's only on the less severe. Meaning, if it's an asay, like one didn't eat matzah at the Seder, one didn't put on tefillin, one didn't say the Kriya Shema, one violated the laws of kashrus, which is only a losaseh, one more shapnis, that's kalos. It's Mechaper even if he didn't do tshuva. What's considered kalos, the less severe and the more severe averos? If it carries the death penalty of kores, that's chamuros. So the Sar Mishtaleach is mechaper if he did tshuva. Although I said normally, later we'll see one needs yisurim, one needs other things till he's fully has the full kapora. But if he does tshuva, the Sar Mishtaleach is mechaper fully. Ushua shov, the sheker. First takes a shua in vain. What's a shua shov? A person swears, let's see, there's a table. So it's obvious. And he says, I swear this is a table. That's shvua shov. It's in vain. There's no reason to swear. Sheker means person swears falsely. Person swears it's gold and it's silver. Api she'embo kores, although when one swears falsely, it doesn't carry the liability of kores. Harei hemin achamuros, because it's a shvua. The Gemara says in shvuas, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says Losisa Shem Hashov of the Aseret Dibros, it says the Eretz Israel quaked from one end to another. Usha mitzvahs lo saseh, umitzvahs aseh, shema and kores. Other mitzvahs lo saseh says shatnez, kashrus, or aseh, hena kalos. So there, the Sarb Shtalech is mechaper even if one didn't do tshuva. But for the chamuros, which is kores and Mrs. Bezdin, that one needs tshuva. But if one did tshuva and then subsequently sorry is brought, it's thrown down the mountainside, the person has kapara. So here, this Kesef Mishnah goes to gives us the background, the Sarb Shtalech, whether you need tshuva, whether you don't need tshuva. So if you take a look at the Kesef Mishnah, it's the inner Pirish on the Rambam. Mishnah per kam deshuas al shar averos shebetoiro hakalos chamuros vazdoinos vashkogos hoda v'lo hoda. Whether he's aware of it, whether he's not aware of it, asi v'lo sase, whether it's a positive, negative commandment, krisus and he's bezdin, so much like mechaper. Gemara hainu umara. The Gemara explains kalos hainu ese v'lo sase. Kalos, the less severe, or eselos asay, hainu hachamuros, hainu krisus mises bezdin. But it's what are chamuros, kores and mises bezdin, hoda hainu mezid, lo hoda hainu shogeg. On review the hochi komar, kol she'eno averu shebeteiro, kalos bechamuros, ben shosem b'shog, ben shosem b'mezid, Ocean shows Mishogeg, Ben Nodalo, Sveikon, Ben Shlonod, Sveikon, Kalos. Tas Ele Chamuros. Second. See, over here, Aval Leibid Rabuda, Dafkab Shos Tshuva, some Shlep Aval Los Tshuva, Emechaper. According to the Chachomim, only if you do Tshuva. The Yodua shen haloch Rebbe Chaveiro v'lachin koser Rabbeinu she'osa tshuva. Avol, mashekosa v'lo osa tshuva, ein atzom shchape el kalos, kosher li, dosa mashmad lo rabora afilu over asay im lo osa tshuva, ein atzom mechaper, lo Rebbe afilu achamuris mechaper v'lo tshuva, chutz miporik ol, v'megalapon b'atoiro, beifi bris, tzorchiyun. He has difficult with the Rambam. According to the way the Gemara explains it, contribute nosi, even when there's tshuva on anything, not the chamuras, not the kalos, according to Chacham, you have to have tshuva on everything. And yet the Rambam divides it. He says, if it's kalos, if it's the lo sase uriyase, even if one does not tshuva, there's sars mechaper. And if it's chamuros, like kores mises bezdin, if one does tshuva. According to the Chacham, they don't make no differentiation between kalos and chamuros. You have to have tshuva. According to Rabbi Yudan Nosi, Rebbe, even if one does not do tshuva, there's some shleich mechaper. So how does the Rambam divide it, where there's no such position in the Gemara? According to the Chacham, you need tshuva on everything, and according to Rebbe, one doesn't have tshuva on anything. The stoyer, the goat that's thrown down the mountainside, brings about kapara. Doesn't answer it. Okay, we'll leave that right now. Just want to mention something. I'd asked the question. We asked the question. We had mentioned in Mitzvah Chinuch that when the Gemara says that in Mehir Tshuva B'libo, if a person has stirrings of tshuva in his heart, even if he doesn't verbalize it, his classification is tzaddik. That the Rambam says you have to have vidui peh, you have to verbalize it. That's in terms of bringing back kapora. For kapora, you have to have vidu peh. You have to verbalize the confession. The tshuva, in terms of classification, to be reclassified from Rasha to tzaddik, even if one in his heart has stirrings of tshuva, charote, kabbalah, his classification is tzaddik. So when the Gemara says, versus a Rasha, and he marries a woman and says, Harei amashani tzaddik gomor, even though he didn't verbalize anything, if actually he did have these stirrings of tshuva in his heart, he has a reclassification. Does he have kapara? He doesn't have kapara. The Rambam speaks specifically in terms of atonement, which is a full reinstatement. That's the Rambam. That's what the Beit explains. So I asked the question, the Gemara says in Zvochim that if one brings a korban and one does not do tshuva with vidui, the Gemara says it's zevach u'sham to'eva. It's the zevach of a rosha, which is a to'eva. The korban itself is not a valid korban. A korban without tshuva is not a valid korban. How do we know that you have to say vidui by a korban? The Rambam quotes the posuk. He says chatos and hashamos, when you bring the chatos or the osham, it has to be predicated on tshuva and vidui. So it seems to be you have to say vidui. If you don't say vidui, it's considered not a valid korban because it's zevach u'sham to'eva. It's the zevach of a rosho, therefore it's a to'eva. Therefore, it's considered an abomination. You can't bring such a korban on mizbeach. So we asked, according to Mitzvah Chinuch, even though kapara-wise he doesn't have kapara, why is the zevach roshoim? Why is the zevach of a rosha? His classification is tzaddik. That's the question we asked. So we said that maybe, as I gave it the comparison to a person's Torah. A person's a leper, he's sent out of all the camps. As much as he does tshuva, as much as he verbalizes, he's not permitted to come back into the camp until he's fully recovers from tzaras, from the leprosy. Why? Because when you have leprosy, the Torah says, Lo yitamis machneim. You can't re-enter into the camp, any of the camps, because you contaminate the machne. That's the reason why the leper can't come back. Factually speaking, the Torah says only if a person does tshuva, which brings about a certain degree of kapora, the kapora is not complete until you bring the korban. But unless you bring the kapora, you have the kapora, you can't bring that korban. Because he's still carrying the impurity of the chet, and that impurity classifies you as a rosha in terms of kapora. Meaning like this. We've mentioned the name of the Ramak in the Torah Dvorah that if a person is stoned, how does a person normally stone? They put him on elevation, which is the equivalent of his height. They tie his hands and feet together, behind his hands behind his back and his feet together, and they push him up backwards. Normally, when you fall backwards and you can't brace your fall, what happens? The person breaks his neck. If he dies immediately, he dies. But let's say he still has some life in him. They just take a stone. They don't pummel his body with stones. They just put a stone on his chest, and that ends his life. A person is killed by the sword, what they call sayif, or the cloth, which is chenek, strangulation. After he's stoned, after he's killed with the sword, after he's strangled with the cloth, what do they do with the stone, the sword, and the cloth? The halacha is the Gemara has to be buried. Now the question is, why do you have to bury it? So the Ramak explains, when a person deserves the death penalty, as we discussed many times in Reb Chaim Volozhina and in the Ramchal, an impurity is created due to the chet. That impurity goes on the person, and that's the diminishment of his level of kedusha. When a person normally does tshuva, that impurity immediately dissipates. The tshuva vaporizes that impurity. Therefore, he's reinstated. If one does that verbal confession, there's no kapara, means the impurity remains on that person. Remains. Even reclassification, he's reclassified as what? as a tzaddik, but factually he has the impurity of that chet, and that weighs on him. When a person is stoned, even the person is put to death, he does tshuva before they put him to death. The Bezdin has him do tshuva. When he does tshuva now, when they put him to death, the impurity of that chet, which carries the death penalty, passes from his body onto that stone. It passes from his body onto that sword, from his body onto that cloth that they strangle him with. Therefore, because it has that representation of the chet, because literally that impurity went onto that object that ended his life, it has to be buried. That's the concept. So the Orach Chaim HaKadosh explains something similar by a korban. When a person sins b'shogeg, you violate Shabbos inadvertently. It's a chet. It creates an impurity, even though it's a shogeg. When a person does tshuva and you bring the korban, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh explains, the impurity of the chet, which is on the person, passes onto the korban. You understand? It goes onto the korban. So when the korban is brought, and you follow the ritual of the Torah, the shechita, the Kabbalah, the holocha, and the zrika, which are the 4 stages of dam, now that animal you officially has that tum on it, that impurity of the chet, and when you burn it, it's totally destroyed. And that's why the person is fully atoned. So the Orach Chaim HaKadosh asks, if that's the case, even if a person sins mazid, you should be able to bring a korban. So he explains that because the intensity of the impurity of mazid is greater than the impurity of shogeg, if that impurity goes on the korban becomes putrefied. You can't bring a putrefied korban on the mizbeach. You're disgracing the mizbeach. It's a shogeg, even though it's impurity. It's not considered inappropriate. That's the tshuva process. That's the atonement process. But if it's mazid, if a person sins deliberately, the intensity of impurity is greater. So when it passes from the person onto the korban, you're bringing a korban which is putrefied. A putrefied korban you cannot bring on a mizbeach. That's how the Orach Chaim HaKadosh explains it. Similar concept with the Ramak, the Talmud Torah says regarding the stone, the sword, and the strangulation cloth. That's exactly the concept of the korban, why the korban brings kapara when you do tshuva, because the impurity passes from the person onto the korban. Okay? Now, kapara means it causes the tumah, the impurity, to pass off the person. The only time it passes off the person, you have to have oral confession. You have to verbalize the confession. If he only has the feelings in your heart, it's a reclassification of tzaddik. But in terms, who's the person? That person is still that deficient person. He's weighted down with that impurity. So let's say a person brings a korban, and in his heart, he does tshuva, but he didn't verbalize it. If that's the case, kapara means the impurity passes from him onto the korban. Here we didn't verbalize the confession. The korban which is being brought, that korban doesn't have the impurity of the person. It's a rasha. It's the impurity of a rasha which never passed off him. What he possesses is the impurity of a rasha. It's zevach rishoyim toeva. The korban of a rasha is toeva because you're bringing an animal which is not following the process of atonement. It's an abomination because normally the korban takes on the impurity of the person. Therefore, a pure person is bringing the korban, which has his impurity on it. But if he didn't make the oral confession, that means the impurity doesn't pass on to the korban. So what is the zevach? What is the korban? It's the korban of a person who's a rasha, because he still possesses that impurity, because the process is it's supposed to pass on to the korban, and the person bringing it no longer has that impurity, which is not the case over here. Therefore, the korban is not a valid korban. It's called the korban of a rasha. He is a rasha because he possesses the purity of the rasha, because normally the process is when he brings the korban, that impurity already passes on to the korban, and he no longer has that impurity. That's the concept.